have one of these, that'd be great. We know the saying, right? All good things must come to an end, and so it does tonight for us in this book of Nahum, and I've certainly enjoyed it. Our study of this little book, kind of nestled here at the end of the Old Testament among the minor prophets, and as it deals with Nineveh, this capital city of Assyria, and book, we said, could be easily broken down in 3 themes, and we'll get to those hopefully here. My iPad is apparently working on Monday's schedule, not Wednesdays. I don't know. Can you take me to the next one? Thank you. All right. We said the first chapter number 1. The theme was really, or the focus is this: God is jealous. And it starts out from verse number 1 and following and detailing that. And especially verse number 2, God is jealous, the Lord revengeth, and it goes on there. And then we saw how, letter A, that God speaks of himself there in the first few verses. Then we saw that God speaks to Nineveh, and then he speaks to Judah. We saw the third point there, and that pretty much sums up chapter 1. Again, we're not going to rehash everything, but chapter 2, and I love the outline. It's a good one that you and I can remember as we think about this little book of Nahum and so forth. So Roman number 2, we understood that God is judge, right? How Nineveh will fall, and that was the description throughout of it. And the first thing we looked at is how the city flourished before judgment, and then we looked at how the city will fall in judgment, during judgment, and the judgment that would come, and the terribleness of it, we might say. And then letter C, how they will fare after the judgment, the utter devastation. And archaeologically, we looked at that and so forth. And then we moved into chapter 3 last week together, and boy, it's a great little teaser for the rest of the chapter in a sense. And really, chapter 3, we said it's kind of presented to you and I as a justifying chapter. In other words, kind of reasoning with the Assyrians, reasoning with Judah. Here's why God is doing what he was doing. Why judgment was going to fall in this terrible judgment that is falling. Why it would fall. And we made this observation. I think it's crucial, and so I remind you again that the God of heaven never needs to justify his actions to his creation. What he's doing, what he allows, and so forth. He doesn't have to justify that. We don't deserve it, nor can we demand him to do so. And many people try that, right? Demand of God. And just heard of a situation already today, and of someone demanding God do something. If God doesn't do it, then he's not living up to my expectations and so forth. Well, can I just tell you, the creation never has a right to demand out of the Creator. It is only by his grace and kindness that he ever tells us why he does what he does. And Nahum chapter 3 is such an instance of that. And so it will show us that God is indeed just. And explaining why Nineveh will fall. We observed last week, man, he doesn't waste any time. Verse number 1 jumps right into it, right? And he lists them as liars, robbers, and murderers. That's quite the lineup, isn't it? Look at verse number 1 again in chapter 3, verse 1. Woe to that bloody city, or the bloody city. It is all full of lies and robbery. The prey departeth not. And we talked about this bloody city as it's described here, and we talked about how Nineveh had grown rich through lies and violence, right? And we established that last time. Then the next couple verses in verse 2 and 3, we saw what, it's a historical statement, but it's also a prophetical statement. Look at verse 2 again. The noise of a whip, the noise of the rattling of the wheels, and of the prancing horses, and of the jumping chariots. Verse 3, the horseman lifteth up both the bright sword and the glittering spear, and there is a multitude of slain, and a great number of carcasses, and there is none end of their corpses. They stumble upon their corpses. And we talked about the vivid description of it. Man, it's somewhat morbid, isn't it? I mean, it's out there. I mean, it's probably rated PG, right? You know, in the sense of what it describes, the corpses everywhere, stumbling over carcasses and so forth. But this is who the Ninevites were. This is who the Middle East knew them to be. As far as Egypt and all around, and people, this was their reputation. This was their testimony. They were murderers of the multitudes of innocent people. And we looked rather in-depthly how God is going to hold them accountable. That's what chapter 3 is saying. It's going to hold them accountable to that fact, that shedding of innocent blood. And besides describing what was done in the past, though, now the prophetical aspect of verses 2 and 3 is simply revealing this, that Assyria will indeed get a taste of their own medicine, as these same things will happen in Nineveh. We'll see that rather expressed rather clearly tonight, too, in the rest of the passage. The very acts that have made them a name to fear and a force to flee from will now take place in their own city. And then we looked, as we finished up last week, verses 4 and 5. Would you look there again and just again kind of get us back into the context of the chapter? Because of the multitude of the whoredoms of the well-favored harlot, the mistress of witchcraft that selleth nations through her whoredoms and families through her witchcrafts. Behold, I am against thee, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will discover thy skirts upon thy face, and I will show thy nations thy nakedness, and the kingdoms thy shame. And so, letter B, we saw this, that God is described as a harlot. And that term, well-favored harlot, right? And she was seductive. She was attractive to other nations and so forth. A harlot given to whoredoms and a mistress of witchcraft, as we saw last time. We noted that often in Scriptures we find that idolatry is associated with or pictured by prostitution and adultery and such. We understand that. That happens a lot within Scriptures. And then we tied in the reality that the chief deity there in Nineveh and much of Mesopotamia was Ishtar, the goddess of love, fertility, war, and so forth. And so this metaphor presented to us in these verses makes complete sense, right? As God describes her as a spiritual harlot, committing whoredoms, a mistress with witchcraft and such. And so it's a metaphor appropriate. And I was reading some historical accounts. Some believe from some of the things left from when Nineveh fell and so forth, that even the night before the Babylonian Medes army showed up, they were partying and having drunken orgies and all kinds of stuff happening within the city. So even tied into their worship were these things. And so that God described them as this is rather shocking and astonishing to us, but this was a legitimate and an appropriate metaphor and picture that he describes them as. We see that immorality and even witchcraft went hand in hand with this idolatry of Nineveh. And so God was going to judge this great sin. In verses 6 and 7, we're told that this harlot city, full of idolatry and witchcraft and immorality, would be shamed, disgraced, viewed with contempt by all. In fact, it is very descriptive. God would reveal the nakedness of Nineveh to all the kingdoms and all the surrounding nations. Now we get to the rest of verse 3, or chapter 3. In chapter 3, in the remaining things, there's some amazing pictures delivered to us and given to us. It's like illustrations, right? And so the Bible gives us several to picture the humble and, shall we say, thorough defeat of this once proud city. And all of these images give us this focal point, or shall we say the picture, the overall picture. What is that? Well, you see it there, letter C in our outline. Nineveh, a proud and strong city, humbled and devastatingly destroyed. So it kind of comes back to chapter 2, doesn't it? How the judgment will fall. It kind of says, listen, all right, we'll go back to, yes, why the judgment was going to fall. We see that described in the prior verses, and now it's going to get a little bit more in-depth, a few more images of how that will look. Verses 8 and 9 are especially noteworthy. Look at verse 8 and 9 with me, if you will, okay? Notice what it says here. Chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. And art thou better than populous No, that was situate among the rivers that had the waters round about, whose rampart was the sea, and her wall was from the sea? Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. Put and Lubim were thy helpers. Now, that's interesting little verses here, right? Immediately starts with this question, and this question is posed to Nineveh, and it literally says, art thou better? Are you better? And then it mentions this, populous, in other words, well-populated, no. No. Now that city may not ring any bells per se with you and I, but the picture is clear. You see at number 1, there's 7 pictures here, or 7 things that we'll note from the rest of the passage. Number 1 is this, a once great city that fell quickly and terribly. Okay, so what Nahum was doing, what God is doing through Nahum, he's saying, okay, I want you to bring back a blast from the past, all right? I want you to recall something. This week, Caden and Ryan, I was helping them with some schooling and some things, and we were watching some documentaries, and Caden made this comment to me. He goes, listen, I want to see a war that's happened recently. And then he made the comment, I want to see a war that you were alive for. And so I'm like, you know what? The only thing that I can really remember for me was Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And I remember it, right? And I remember vividly watching the images come through and all looking constantly for news of what was happening there in Kuwait and then eventually Iraq and what the American forces and even British forces and others were doing together to thwart Saddam Hussein. And so I remember that, right? And as he asked those questions, it just brought up all these memories and so forth and showed him a little documentary about it. And he was watching like, oh, yeah, I remember that. You know, it brought back these thoughts and these memories. Well, when Nahum mentions no, immediately the Ninevites are like, yeah, we know that city. Oh, yeah, we remember that. It wasn't too long ago that this great city of No fell. In fact, they may have known it by some other names. See, No is Noaman, another name for it, and then the Greeks would call it Thebes. Thebes, that's the Greek name for it. This is probably the most common name for this city there in Egypt. And so immediately, this is what about Thebes was the capital of what is called Upper Egypt, okay? So it's kind of weird because Upper Egypt is the southern part of Egypt, okay? I don't know how that works and messes me up all the time, but they do it based upon how the Nile flows. It flows from south to north, and so their Upper Egypt is in the south, and Higher Egypt, or whatever they call it, is above that, closer to the Mediterranean and everything else, okay? So if you really wanted to care, that's what it is, okay? And lower and upper is actually what they terminize, okay? So this is the capital city there in the southern portion in the Upper Egypt. Now, what's interesting about that is that it rivaled Nineveh. Before Nineveh was around, this was the city, okay? It was at the location of modern-day Luxor and again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing them correctly, but Karnak or Kanak. So you see approximately where it is. Isn't it up there by the Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Mesopotamia area there is sometimes described, the delta, okay? It's farther down on the Nile, but close also to the Red Sea, and that's an important aspect about it. And the name is, again, three names, Noaman, and then Thebes. Well, Noaman is a term referring to the home of Ammon or Ammon. Ammon was an Egyptian false god, idolatry, right? As we know, Egypt certainly was into, and it's usually depicted by a human body and a ram head. And so he was associated with this city, of course, and such. The city was renowned in its heyday for its size and its wealth, even its vast military might. Homer mentioned it later, and he would describe it as the city of 100 gates, and certainly prolific in that sense. It was considered impregnable during, again, when it was in power, when Egypt was thriving during that dynasty and things like that. And so it was renowned, again, as we said, for wealth and everything else. During the time of its conquering pharaohs, in other words, when they were really the kings of the land, they collected taxes all over the Middle East. Thebes did. Even to the point of reaching up to Greece and over to where Nineveh and Babylon were. They had conquered all these areas. And so, can I describe it this way? Because this kind of hits home with Nahum. When they heard the populous city of No, or Na, I don't know how you pronounce it per se, but the populous city of No, what they thought of was, well, they were the Assyrians before we were. They were the rulers of everything before we were. They were the people taking over everything and conquering lands and people before we came along. So they were the Assyrians of their day, much like the Babylonians would be the Assyrians of their day. You see, much like Nineveh, the city of Thebes was established on the main waterway of Egypt, the Nile River, and you see it even pictured here. It really served as natural protection from enemies. It was a strongly fortified city with formidable walls even. I like what one commentator says, and look at verse number 8 again. See how it's described, the city. It was situated among the waters, that had the waters round about, whose rampart was the sea. And that has caused some confusion about location. Some have thought, well, it's describing like closer to the Mediterranean Sea or something like that, where it makes this statement here, whose rampart was the sea and her wall was from the sea. I like what this commentator and historian said, and he described verse number 8 description there. He says, the description of the city applies remarkably to Thebes. which alone of all the cities of Egypt was built on both sides of the river. And that graphic you maybe saw of the city, an old map, showed how the Nile was even kind of split and city was in the middle on either side. And so you see this description here. It was built on both sides of the river, here twice called, as now by modern inhabitants, the sea. And so they would refer to the Nile River as the sea. And so you see, even as Nahum describes it as such, situated on the sea, even today there are those who live in the area that refer to the Nile River as the sea. And you can imagine with the vastness of the water why they do so. And also, it was close enough to the Red Sea where they controlled and commanded the chief line of commerce and trade that flourished on the Red Sea and came into Egypt and so forth. So here's this great city. And it's strong. Verse number 9 pictures it unified. This is Egypt and Ethiopia together. They've also, and verse number 9 describes this, right? They've made a powerful alliance with the two nations, modern-day Libya, and put there and such. So they have this strong confederacy of all these nations around them there in Africa. And boy, they are a strong nation. I mean, what Nineveh is at this point, was back then, Nahum, Thebes was. And so God brings them to the forefront of the mind of the Ninevites and even of those Jews in Judah and say, listen, do you remember that? Do you think you're better than them? I love that question. Do you think you're going to get away with it? Do you think that, listen, this nation, if any city could stand against an invading force, it had to be Thebes. And yet, you remember what happened to them, don't you? You know what's interesting about this city of Thebes and the reference to it here in Nahum? The city would fall in 663 BC. So before the fall of the Ninevites, obviously, and so forth, several decades. But you know who they fell to? Who conquered them? In what is described in the reference here of, hey, you remember how No fell and Thebes, how it fell? And we'll read a vivid description in verse 10 of how that came about. Do you realize who did it? Don't miss it. The Assyrians. The Assyrians did. So here he is, God's using Nahum saying, yeah, you remember this city. You conquered it. It was your nation that conquered this great and formidable city, this impregnable city. No one could break through, and you were the ones that did that. In fact, that certainly, let's back up. Verse 10 describes what the invading Assyrians did. Look at verse number 10, would you? This is quite descriptive. Yet was she carried away, so captives, right? She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed in pieces at the top of all the streets. And they cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. So a depiction of what the Syrians would often do going into a city and so forth, and the murder of children, the taking of slaves, the honorable men, the noblemen were just kind of auctioned off, if you could describe it as such. You see, despite its wealth, its strength, its greatness, Nahum fell, and it was conquered and destroyed by the Assyrians. I love this historical account. Remember how we've talked about the Ninevites and the Assyrians. They began, even in the last 100 years, excavating archaeological sites, and they've been discovering some of their own historical records in libraries where they recorded some of their conquests around the world. And as they did so, they began finding historical accounts of it. And I love this one. It describes the account of them sacking the city of Thebes. It says this: the Assyrians plundered the metropolis, whose temples contained boundless wealth. Now let's stop there a second. This is hitting home for the Ninevites. This is like looking in the mirror. This is a city like them who have great wealth. They spoiled other nations. They'd taken taxes from everybody. It's like looking in the mirror. And as the Assyrians, notice the quote here from Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria who conquered it. He said this: I conquered the whole city. Silver, gold, precious stones, the whole contents of its palace, colored vestments, linen, magnificent horses, slaves, both men and women, 2 great obelisks of shining bronze weighing 2,500 talents. I like this one. He went to the temple, opened the gates. He goes, I like the temple gates so much, I took them home. That's what he says. I took the temple gates from their place. I brought them to Assyria. Enormous spoils of priceless worth did I take with me from Thebes, exalted Ashurbanipal. It's a great, it's a story and a half, right? He's calling, you remember this? You remember when you folks did this? You think you're better than them? And it makes us think, why did God allow that? Well, why were the Assyrians allowed to go into Egypt and wreak havoc there too, as they did in Israel and so forth, and tried to do in Judah? Why did God allow that? Well, the answer is the very reason that this book of Nahum is written. It's that God had judged them to be worthy of punishment. Remember, this is what Jeremiah wrote. This is interesting. Jeremiah wrote this: the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, saith, Behold, I will punish the multitude of No. The multitude of No, and Pharaoh, and Egypt, with their gods and their kings, even Pharaoh, and all them that trust in him. What is one of the things we know about Egypt? What did they hold their Pharaoh up as? As a what? As a god. He was a god like all the others, and Nile was a god, the sun was a god, and they had all this idolatry, and boy, their pharaohs were considered to be God incarnate, every single one of them, and so forth, no matter how they acted and what they did. And so you see that God is calling them under judgment. And it began here with what the Assyrians did and so forth. Ezekiel will join Jeremiah in the prophecy. And so keep your spot here, would you? I want to go to Ezekiel and just read a little passage with you. I think this is will help us in the tie-in. Ezekiel chapter 30. Would you read verses 10 and following with me? Ezekiel chapter 30, as we think about that verse in Jeremiah, what we've read here in Nahum, and Ezekiel chapter 30 now, and in verse number 10 and following. This is an interesting passage in Ezekiel, and we might find ourselves back in Ezekiel someday in our Wednesday night studies, because it's a very dynamic and interesting book. But verse number 10 says this: Thus saith the Lord God, I will also make the multitude of Egypt to cease by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now that's interesting, okay? But he goes on, verse 11, he and his people with him, the terrible of the nations, shall be brought to destroy the land. And they shall draw their swords against Egypt and fill the land with the slain. Verse 12. And I will make the rivers dry and sell the land into the land of the wicked. And I will make the land waste and all that is therein by the hand of strangers. I, the Lord, have spoken it. Thus saith the Lord God, I will also destroy the idols. I will cause their images to cease out of Noph. And there shall be no more a prince of the land of Egypt. And I will put a fear in the land of Egypt. Verse 14, and I will make Pathros desolate, and will set fire in Zoan, and will execute judgments in No. Verse 15, and I will pour my fury upon Sin, the strength of Egypt, and I will cut off the multitude of No. That's interesting. Now, we're going to talk about this in just a second. This is culminating in Nebuchadnezzar. And we see that when the Assyrians came along, it's kind of a prejudgment, precursor to what God is condemning them for. It's kind of a warning, I think it is. I would call it the chastening of God in the city of No and in Egypt. When Ashurbanipal and the Assyrians come in, he's kind of saying, hey, you better shape up. You better get rid of this, or I'm going to send Nebuchadnezzar in, as he promised here. But I would draw your attention to verse 19. I think it really sums it up well, these kinds of judgments we find. Look at verse 19. Thus will I execute judgments in Egypt. Here's why it happens. And they shall know what? They shall know that I am Jehovah. I am the Lord. I am the Lord. See, ultimately, that and what God allows the Assyrians to do at No is to bring himself glory, to establish that he is the Lord. He is Jehovah. He is the God of heaven and earth, and it establishes him as such. And so he allows that to happen. And as we said, okay, the Assyrian conquest of Thebes is a kind of a precursor. It is a prelude to the judgment God's going to bring at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. In 568 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, they went into Egypt, kind of took a lot of spoil from the land. That carried on to Cyrus, the Persian, and he went in there and really decimated. And you see all of this judgment falling upon Egypt. And so God mentions this, and he says, do you think you're better than them? Judgment fell upon them because their idolatry and how they refused me and they worship their own gods. Do you think you're better than them? And so it's a challenge to them that the same fate awaited Nineveh and the Assyrian Empire. You see, in their own actions, what they themselves did in Thebes, they foresaw what would happen to them. Look at verse 11. Notice what it says. Look at verse 11 back here in Nahum and chapter 3. Thou also shalt be drunken. Thou shalt be hid. You see the word also. So he's still connecting it to the question. You think you're better than populace? No, look what happened to them. You did it. And then he goes on in verse 11, thou also shalt be drunken, thou shalt be hid, thou also shalt seek strength because of the enemy. Okay? Number 2, you know what we see, and I kind of changed this on the outline after I printed your outline, okay? So it's a little different. A city made drunk by the cup they do not want. A city made drunk, and so you can add the word made there. I think I put a city drunk from the cup, and so I like this verbiage better. Anyway, a city made drunk by the cup they do not want. What are we talking about here? Well, 11 gives this description, they shall be drunken, right? It's an ominous statement stated here because the picture is this, don't miss it. They would soon be drinking from the cup of God's wrath. This is what they would be drunk with, if we could describe it as such. And this is not unusual from what we read in the Old Testament. Many passages describe it as judgment, as drinking the wine of God's wrath or from the cup of God's wrath. In fact, one of the greatest passages, I think, is Jeremiah chapter 25. Look what Jeremiah chapter 25 and verses 15 and 16 says. For thus saith the Lord God of Israel unto me, take the wine cup of this fury, this wrath, right? At my hand, cause all the nations to whom I send thee to drink it. Notice this description, and they shall drink and be moved and be mad because of the sword, and I will send them, that I will send among them, of the sword that I will send among them. You understand the picture here is they're going to be angry, mad, drunk with the wine that they drink, the cup of wrath of God that they will drink from. You see, the idea is described here in Nahum in verse 11 of chapter 3. The idea is that them being drunk is that they will be overwhelmed. They will not be able to handle what's coming, right? And they will be out of control. They won't any longer be able to control their circumstances. They were a powerful nation that was used to being in control. Well, now they're going to be drunken with the wrath of God, and they will not be able to control their circumstances. They will be at the mercy of the onrushing force God will send as judgment upon them. And you see what was stuck in the middle of verse 11 there? I like that little insertion of the statement. He says, thou shalt be hid. You know, perhaps that's a prophetical statement about how the ruins of the great city would remain hidden in the sands of the desert of the Middle East for so long. How we discovered that, we looked at how they thought that, we don't think this exists. It just must have been a mythical city because we haven't found it. And I love that that's written here. God says, listen, thou shalt be hid. I'm just going to cause the sands of the desert to cover you up. I believe that's likely what that's talking about. And then it alludes to the fact that no alliances or friends would be found to help. No aiding strength will come to the rescue, the verse says. How easily would this great nation fall? Well, verse 12 answers it. Look at verse 12. All thy strongholds shall be like fig trees with the first ripe figs. If they can be shaken, they shall even fall, or if they be shaken, they shall even fall into the mouth of the eater. So number 3, what's the picture? What's the image? They're a city ripe for the picking. They are the city ripe for the picking. It's said that when a fig tree that is full of ripe figs is shaken even gently, the vast majority of the figs will fall off the tree. And how many of you like figs? Anybody like figs here? How many like fig Dukes? That's the only kind of fig I've ever had. Okay, thank you. That's about my only exposure to figs, all right? All I can think of is in the fall when, we start getting cooler temperatures. The apple trees are bearing, the apples are just, they're loaded down with it. And we have a couple apple trees. I remember sometimes when I'm mowing, if I hit a branch, all the apples fall on my head or something like that, right? And you're shaking. That's kind of the picture here, right? When the figs are ripe. All you got to do is shake it a little bit, and the figs are going to come falling down. In fact, I like the description here. It falls into the mouth of the eater. It's quite the picture. Quickly devoured. The strongholds of the city would fall like figs. The great army would falter and flee before the invaders. The city itself would easily fall into the hands of the enemy, just like ripe figs from a tree that is gently shaken. It's quite the picture, right? He said, listen, Nineveh, you're gonna be ripe for the picking. All the Medes and Babylonians, all they got to come do is gently shake the tree, and man, you're just going to fall right before them. You're not going to be able to stand it. And you know what that does? That really begs the question, what about this great army? This army that Hezekiah and Judah and all these nations feared and glory. They heard they were moving into their land and their area, and they were scared. They tried to barter peace and buy peace and do whatever they could to avoid the Assyrians conquering them. What happened to this great army? These great, harsh, mean, fierce, and scary soldiers of Assyria. Look at verse 13. It answers it for us. Look at verse 13. It says this, behold, thy people in the midst of thee are women. The gates of thy land shall be set wide open upon thine enemies. The fire shall devour thy bars. As one commentator put it, their shock and awe troops would become like fearful women who are frightened out of their wits. Another commentator described it this way. He said this, fierce, fearless, hard iron men, such as their warriors, still are portrayed by themselves on their monuments. In other words, excavated monuments have described their warriors and strong and just fierce men. They whom no toil wearied, no peril daunted, shall be one in all, their whole people, women. Like fearful women. I think the picture's kind of like young women and just scared and frightened. And all courage will be lost. There will be little resistance. And furthermore, look at the description here. Because if the gates of the city are open wide to the invading force, the barred gates would be nothing before the onslaught. And ultimately, the city would burn. Then we find an interesting insertion. Verse number 14 is kind of like a warning. Notice what it says. Draw the waters for the siege. Fortify thy strongholds. Go into clay and tread the mortar. Make strong the brick kiln. Okay? This is ironic sarcasm. This is irony presented, right? Because the author's saying, listen, you better get a whole bunch of water for your siege. The walls aren't going to be tall enough. You need to go into the brick kiln and make more bricks and build up the wall. You need to get some bricks ready to fill in the hole because he knows nothing's going to stand before the Medes and the Babylonians as they come. More importantly, can I just tell you what it is? It's a facetious counsel. Why? Because the author knows that anything or anyone that has been weighed in the balances of God and been found wanting cannot stand before the judgment of God. He knows it, right? And so verse 14 is kind of a mocking, sarcastic irony. Say, hey, do all you can, man. You better get ready. It's coming. You're not going to be able to stand against it. Bring in all the water you think you need. Get all the bricks ready that you think you can. And I love what is pictured next. Number 4, it's pictured as a city that will be stripped clean and laid bare by a plague of locusts. Look at verse 15. Quite the description again. There shall the fire devour thee, the sword shall cut thee off, it shall eat thee up like the cankerworm. Make thyself many as the cankerworm, make thyself many as the locust. Again, the mention of the fire devouring the city, the sword flying freely and cutting down the Assyrians. Then we get this picture of cankerworms. And it flows through the next few verses, the picture of the locust, right? And the idea of descending upon the city and ravaging it. The cankerworm, what is that? The cankerworm was an early stage form of a locust, right? It was a devouring caterpillar. So what we have described for us is how the land will be stripped clean as if by a plague of grasshoppers or locusts. Look at verse 16. It gives another vivid picture. Notice it. Thou hast multiplied thy merchants above the stars of heaven. That's quite a statement. The cankerworm spoileth and fleeth away. Being situated on the Tigris River, we've seen that they've already been a hub for caravan trade routes through the Middle East. Even ships and things would come on the Tigris River and things. The commerce and trade of Nineveh had brought in vast wealth. It was unrivaled. But have you ever seen a locust descend upon a field of corn, a field of grain? When millions of locusts or grasshoppers come, and as we've read in plagues before, and even now in Africa, you can watch videos of huge swarms and clouds of locusts and grasshoppers descending on vital grain. That's the picture here. This once thriving city that had all this trade and everything else going on. The merchants were a dime a dozen because there's so many. It would be stripped bare. It would be left completely bare, totally spoiled. Begs the question, what happens to all the leaders during this time? What about these genius generals that would help them conquer different cities and did different things? Some of the things the Assyrians did to bring down cities and get inside walls is quite ingenious. What happens to all of these? Where are they at during this time? Look at verse 17. It answers it. Verse 17, thy crown are as the locusts. So now they're compared, and thy captains as the great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges in the cold day. But when the sun ariseth, they flee away, and their place is not known where they are. Number 5, we see pictured for us the image of a city whose leadership would fly and flee. The time that the common people, the citizens of the city, needed their leaders the most would be the time that they became like grasshoppers and locusts. And it's quite a picture here, right? It's like they became lethargic in the cold, and they're hiding out in the hedge is what's pictured here. But the sun comes up, and maybe you've seen it, right? And maybe on your windows at times there'll be a bug who, during the cold temperatures, they just kind of, they nestle in there, they nest in there. But then the heat comes. Okay? And they start to awaken and they start to move and then they leave and fly off your window. That's what's pictured here. Now, it's a great picture because you know what Nahum's saying? They're like these locusts, and boy, they're in the cold, they're just kind of hanging out. But boy, you bring on the heat and they're just going to fly away. The leaders and the generals are going to leave the city behind. They're going to flee and run. And so the picture is this. When the heat of the battle fell upon Nineveh, their leaders, their generals, their captains, as it says here, would fly and flee away. Never be found in this time of need. That's quite the picture. What about the rest of the people? Look at verse 18. Quickly, verse 18. Thy shepherds slumber, O king of Assyria. Thy nobles shall dwell in the dust. Thy people is scattered upon the mountains. No man gathereth them. This is quite the description. It's number 6, the pictures of a city betrayed by sleeping leaders, the shepherds, scattered and forgotten. Asleep at the controls. Someone caught unprepared, they're easy prey. That's how the shepherds or the prince or counselors, these would be the ones who were the advisors. These were the people who were tasked with the safety of the state and of the city. They'd be found asleep at the wheel. And what would be the result of it? People would be scattered. Some taken captive, some murdered or killed and by the invading forces and such. Others running to the mountains. That included the noble people, the rich and powerful, the movers and shakers. Like chaff to the wind, they would be scattered. And seemingly even more harsh is this statement: no man's going to gather them. Nobody's going to go and rally together the Assyrians. They would be just scattered to the wind in all kinds of places. In fact, much is believed historically that different groups of the Kurds came from the Assyrians, that they just had to settle wherever they could, and no man would gather them. In other words, the statement is this: they would never be reunited as one nation and one people again. And to that I say, what God does well. What God does well. So what more can be said? Well, just one more verse. Verse number 19. There is no healing of thy bruise. Thy wound is grievous. All that hear the bruit of thee shall clap the hands over thee. For upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually? Number 7, here it is, the last picture. A city that will be dealt a fatal wound. This imagery of the wound, of the fatal wound given, much to the delight of its victims. I mean, it's a fitting end in this verse, isn't it? This would be the final fatal blow for Nineveh and the Assyrians. They would not survive this judgment. God has spoken, the wound would be grievous, and it's beyond healing. It's beyond repair. We might say in common vernacular, their fate is sealed. When it happens, when the Medes and the Babylonians show up to deal them this fatal blow, shall we call it, the fatal wound, news would be brought to all the cities. And you can imagine reaching Judah and Israel and even the city of Nahum and Thebes and many other countries and nations that have been conquered by the Assyrians. And word would pass. And you know what the Bible says and describes here? That in response to this news coming, there would be cheering and applause. Did you catch that little word? At first reading, I thought it maybe referred to the bruteness, right? When they hear the brute of the thing. That's not what the term means. It's an interesting old English word and translated from the Hebrew word here. The word brute, you find it there, literally means announcement or report. In our King James Bible, the Hebrew word's used 15 times. 10 of the 15 times, it is translated as report or fame. Report or fame. So the statement is clear here that when people heard of this happening, the fall of Nineveh, they just cheered, they applauded. And that really deals with the last part of this verse, doesn't it? Here's an interesting little tidbit, trivia. But I think it's a impactful trivia. Do you realize that the book of Nahum ends the exact same way that the book of Jonah ends? With a question. I didn't have time. I'd love to go see how many other books, how many other prophetical books or any other books in the Old Testament actually end with a question, because that's unusual to end with a question. What I think is even more important about this, because we know Jonah. Jonah's preaching the revival to Nineveh, right? We know that. It's tied to this book in Nahum. Now listen, don't miss it. I know we filled in all the blanks, so don't tune me out yet, okay? Okay, now listen. This is cool, okay? Here, this question is quite different than the question in Jonah. We'll look at it in a moment. In fact, it stands in stark contrast. If you were to sum this question up, as we read here at the end of chapter 3, for upon whom hath not thy wickedness passed continually? You know what that is? That's a statement of judgment alluded to in that, hey, listen, all these people, all they know are your hurtful crimes against them. You stand in judgment. You know what the emphasis of the question that ends Jonah is? This is judgment. That is mercy. Note it for me with me. Notice what it says. And should not I spare Nineveh, that great city, wherein are more than 60,000 persons that cannot discern between their right hand and their left hand, and also much cattle. You remember what's happened, right? Jonah is more concerned about his gourd that shriveled up. He wanted God to be done with Nineveh, and God says, listen, can't I show mercy? Shouldn't I show mercy? And I've always wondered, why did it end with a question? You know why it ended with a question, don't you? Because it shows the mercy of God. The undeserved mercy of God. And so here we are, 100 years later, 150 years later, and we come to this next question that is tied to Nineveh. And you know what it's speaking of? The deserved judgment of God. It's amazing. For so many years, God said, all right, Nineveh, you've heard the truth. Jonah preached it. You repented in the moment. You can always return. There's still time. But I'll tell you right now, don't ever miss it. When God sets a deadline, you don't want to miss it. You don't want to miss it. And so this stands as a warning to all the nations and of that day and certainly of this day that would defy God, that would reject His mercy and His grace and go their own way. Be sure your sin will find you out, and the judgment of God is final, and don't miss His deadline. Can I tell you today, the same truth can be preached to America and many other nations. Don't miss the deadline. Your sin will find you out. And so we are left with a simple question. Nineveh, you made your bed, now you get to sleep in it. Judgment is coming.